Over 2000 years of tradition, built slowly, step by step, through a deep exchange between the greatest minds of history, and then suddenly one day, he doesn't agree. During my long metaphysical research, I, as well as others, had not considered something that actually constitutes the key to all mysteries of metaphysics, something that has so far remained completely hidden. This letter by Immanuel Kant was written to his friend Marcus Hertz in 1772, during his so-called silent decade. Throughout these 10 years, Kant got completely absent from the intellectual world, without publishing a single text. But while everyone thought he had simply retired, Kant was meticulously preparing a great revolution, a work destined to change our world forever. In this video, I'll briefly introduce the history of metaphysics through its most important authors. Then I'll show how Kant interprets the tradition before him and how he realizes that the only way to save metaphysics is to completely change our perspective. First of all, metaphysics is one of the oldest branches of philosophy. According to its etymological meaning, metaphysica, the word means literally after physics. The reason is double. The first is that when Andronicus of Rhodes, a scholar of Aristotle, edited Aristotle's work, he published the book of Metaphysics after the Physics. The second is that metaphysics was considered by Aristotle the first philosophy, more important than others. In this sense, the word after in metaphysics means also above or beyond. For this reason, metaphysics, in its broader meaning, has to do with something that is beyond physics, something that remains eternal and resists to the corruption of the physical world. According to the tradition, the first metaphysician was Plato. He is the philosopher who probably impacted the most the direction of the Western world. Metaphysics by Plato is grounded on the separation between the realm of reality and the realm of ideas. The reality, in this sense, is a mere reflection of ideas, which are the eternal entities and true causes. Plato's revolution is often represented with the metaphor of the second navigation. The second navigation is undertaken when the winds fall and the ship remains still. In such circumstances, one must use the strength of his own arms in order to move the boat. What Plato means by this metaphor is that the first navigation was completed by the previous philosophers, who were the naturalists, but their work was not enough to explain the reality. A second navigation, much harder and more methodic, based on reason and the research of the transcendental, what transcends the neutral realm, was necessary to give an adequate explanation of reality. For this reason, Plato is considered the founder of the ideal world, which gives a better account and ground to the sensitive world. Aristotle was the most important scholar of Plato. He is the first one who explicitly talks about metaphysics in terms of first philosophy, referring to its importance. Aristotle built his perspective in contrast to his mentor, namely attempting to reunite the division of the two realms. His definition of metaphysics and its further interpretation conditioned heavily the Western world. In the book Gamma of Metaphysics, Aristotle writes that the aim of this science is to study being as such. According to Heidegger, the whole Western tradition is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of this being, that he calls ontological difference, namely the fact that later philosophers, although they referred to the being, always treated it as beings. Augustine's metaphysics began with a moral and existential problem, namely the problem of evil and its relationship to the good. In opposition to the Manichaeist theory, which grounded the world on two opposite principles, good and evil, Augustine, who was profoundly influenced by Plato through the Neoplatonic school, began what is called by the critics the third navigation. While the pre-Socratic were concerned with the sensitive world and Plato grounded the ideal world, Augustine claims that it's not enough to base the crossing of the sea on our mere strength, referring to Plato. It's necessary to rely on divine revelation and therefore have faith. Here it's no longer a question of either sails, pre-Socratics, or oars, Plato, but of what Augustinus calls as lignum crucis. Clinging with faith to the wood of the cross, man can sail unharmed in the sea of life until he reaches his eternal destination. Unlike Augustine, Thomas was hardly influenced by Aristotle's philosophy, which reached the Western world only around the 12th century through the commentaries of Arab philosophers such as Avicenna or Averroes. In his main work Summa Theologiae, Thomas' main focus is the theology, namely the science of God. Therefore, all the questions within this text are related to God, considered as the efficient and final cause of everything. Thomas will have a great impact on the future of philosophy because of his studies on the being. In particular, he focuses on the question whether being of God is the same of being of man and everything else. In all beings we can distinguish two elements, the essence, quidditas, and being. While Aristotle identified the essence with the form, Thomas claims that the essence is both form and material. This essence doesn't imply the existence of something. Indeed, I can have a definition of something without its existence. Only when the existence is in its actuality, it is said to be being. Otherwise, as essence, it remains in potentiality. But how is this passage from essence or potentiality to being or actuality possible? The answer for Thomas is clear. It is possible due to the intervention of God. Descartes plays a fundamental role in the development of metaphysics. He is indeed said to be the father of the modern philosophy. According to him, metaphysics was the most fundamental science. With a famous analogy, he presents human knowledge as a tree, where the roots of this tree represent metaphysics. The roots are hidden under the ground, therefore they cannot be seen. Nevertheless, they are fundamental to sustain the rest of the tree and provide nourishment. Descartes is also famous because he attempted to find a new ontological ground of the world, something that would resist the ultimate skeptical doubt. This new principle is our thinking. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So Descartes doubts about everything and remains with one only thing, our thinking. The principle becomes cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This changes drastically the perspective of the world. God is still considered the ground and the ultimate truth, but now it's implicitly submitted to our capacity of thinking, namely to our reason. Christian Wolff, who was hardly influenced by Leibniz, is important to mention in order to understand Kant's starting point, since it's based on Wolff's famous structure of philosophy. So according to Wolff, we have the theoretical philosophy and the practical philosophy. Theoretical philosophy is identified in metaphysics, which is divided into general metaphysics and special metaphysics. General metaphysics is the same as Aristotle's, namely an ontology concerned with the being as such, while the special metaphysics is divided into three sections based on their object. We have the cosmology, which is concerned with cosmos, psychology, which is concerned with the soul, and theology, which is concerned with God. Now, two important questions. When Kant is talking about metaphysics, what exactly is he referring to? And how his transcendental philosophy is related to historical metaphysics? This is exactly what we will try to find out in the second chapter of this video, namely Kant and the Copernican Revolution. In order to gain an idea of what Kant considers under the concept of metaphysics, let's take into consideration the two prefaces wrote by Kant to his major work Critique of Pure Reason. So let's begin with the first preface, wrote in the 1781. So Kant writes, "Human reason, in one sphere of its cognition, is called upon to consider questions which it cannot decline, as they are presented by its own nature, but which it cannot answer, as they transcend every faculty of the mind." From the first paragraph we understand that the human reason has a unique destiny in its theoretical domain, some sort of inner contradiction. On the one hand, it faces unavoidably questions which belong to its own nature, namely questions we ask ourselves just because we possess a reason. And on the other hand, the same questions that our reason raises according to its nature we cannot answer because they overpass our own capacity to answer them, at least in the domain of reason. This is something that Kant will explain later in the text, but just to have an idea, let's take into consideration a typical metaphysical question. Does our world have a beginning? If yes, then what came before the beginning? If there was nothing, how do we justify this passage between nothing and something? Kant then continues. It falls into this difficulty without any fault of its own. It begins with principles which cannot be dispensed with in the field of experience, and the truth and sufficiency of which are, at the same time, ensured by experience. With these principles it rises, in obedience to the laws of its own nature, to ever higher and more remote conditions. But it quickly discovers that in this way its labors must remain ever incomplete, because new questions never cease to present themselves. And thus it finds itself compelled to have recourse to principles which transcend the region of experience, while they are regarded by common sense without distrust. It thus falls into confusion and contradictions, from which it conjectures the presence of latent errors, which, however, it is unable to discover, because the principles it employs, transcending the limits of experience, cannot be tested by the criterion. The arena of this endless contest is called metaphysics. In the second paragraph, Kant goes on and underlines that it's not due to some lack of capacities that our reason cannot answer these questions, but rather the nature of the questions themselves. The reason attempts to answer these questions, climbing the realm of experience, searching for a higher principle capable of justifying these questions. The problem is that all the possible principles we find in our experience are all conditional. Namely, they are not ultimate but always conditioned by other principles. What we are truly looking for is an unconditional principle, and since we are unable to find it in the realm of experience, we cross the limits and go beyond it. But because of this audacity, our reason falls into obscurity and contradiction, and it cannot use these principles because since they exceed our experience, we have no criterion to apply them. Now, this infinite battlefield, as Kant calls it, it's exactly what metaphysics is. So metaphysics is this endless attempt of our reason to give an ultimate answer to our unavoidable questions without ever reaching its goal. By understanding this, we can now have a clear idea of what the critique of pure reason represents. Kant writes, I do not mean by this a criticism of books and systems, but a critical inquiry into the faculty of reason, with reference to the cognition to which it strives to attain without the aid of experience. In other words, the solution of the question regarding the possibility or impossibility of metaphysics, and the determination of the origin as well as the extent and limits of the science. All this must be done on the basis of principles. Therefore, the goal of the critique is to inquiry our reason in connection to the knowledge independent from experience. Why does it have to be independent from experience? Because, as we have seen, the unconditional, the ultimate explanation, cannot be found within experience. It's important to underline that this independence from experience is not to be considered in its traditional way, that is, above experience, but rather prior this experience. This is why Kant calls it a priority. The investigation of a priority is at the same time the question about the possibility or impossibility of metaphysics, namely its origins and extent. Let's focus now on this point, which is crucial to understand Kant's project, and consider for a moment what he says in the second preface. In order to explain what is this a priority and why is it so important for the destiny of metaphysics, Kant tells us that we already have two examples of sciences which are based on it, namely mathematics and physics. Regarding mathematics, the shift from experience to a priority happened many centuries before, and this is what Kant writes in the second preface. A new light must have flashed on the mind of the first man, Thales or whatever may have been his name, who demonstrated the properties of the isosceles triangle. For he found that it was not sufficient to meditate on the figure as it lay before his eyes, or the conception of it as it existed in his mind, and thus endeavor to get a knowledge of its properties, but it was necessary to produce these properties, as it were, by a positive a priori construction. and that in order to arrive with certainty to a priori cognition, he must not attribute to the object any other properties than those which necessarily followed from that which he had himself, in accordance with his conception, placed in that object. Two fundamental points to underline here. The first one is that in order to understand the properties of the triangle, Thales didn't have to deduce them from the figure or its concept, but rather to introduce them into the figure what he already thought on his own in his mind, constructing the figure according to the concepts. This means that the two equal lines of the isosceles triangle are introduced by us as properties into the triangle. And this brings us to the second point. In order to gain necessary knowledge about this triangle, we just have to follow what we have previously introduced in it according to the concepts. Let's reconsider this idea in the field of physics, where the revolution came much later in history. Very important in this matter is the Italian astronomer Galileo Galilei, considered the father of the modern science for introducing his experimental or scientific method. What happens in this method? We can summarize it in three fundamental steps. Hypothesis: we observe the nature and introduce a hypothesis about a certain chain of events. Experiment: we create the conditions under which we conduct an experiment and observe the behavior of the chain of events that we have previously selected. And finally, the deduction and formulation of a law. According to our observation and the results, we deduce and formulate a certain law that explains the selected chain of events. This appears as a very intuitive procedure, mostly because our common way of interacting with reality nowadays is based on it. Not even Galileo himself, at the time he conducted the first experiment, realized the scope of this revolution. Indeed, if you consider his biography and take into consideration some highlights of his life, you do recognize a very resourceful and brilliant man. For example, when he used for the first time the recently invented telescope for the scientific purposes instead of military. But you also see a man who is moved by an empirical necessity. Staying by the example of the telescope, Galileo wants to confirm Copernicus' change of perspective, namely the fact that according to his mathematical calculations, the Earth is not in the center of the universe, but rather the Sun. And this is exactly what he does by publishing his famous Sidereus Nuncius. But what he doesn't understand is the scale of his and Copernican revolution. This is because every scientific revolution is always grounded in a metaphysical change of perspective. Therefore, we needed a Kant in order to understand the true greatness of Galileo's and later the Copernican's revolution. So what does Kant see in this very intuitive scientific procedure? Let's take a look at what he writes in the second preface. So Kant says, they learned, and he's referring to the scientists, that reason only perceives that which it produces after its own design, that it must not be content to follow, as it were, in the leading strings of nature, but must proceed in advance with principles of judgment according to its unvarying laws, and compel nature to reply to its questions. And then he writes some lines later, reason must approach nature with the view, indeed, of receiving information from it, not however in the character of a pupil who listens to all that his master chooses to tell him, but in that of a judge who compels the witnesses to reply to those questions which he himself thinks fit to propose. When a scientist conducts an experiment to test hypotheses, he is not just passively observing nature. On the contrary, he is actively shaping it. Thus, the scientific process is not about discovering laws in the nature, but rather constructing the nature itself through the laws of the reason. Kant applies this same method in metaphysics, introducing the so-called Copernican Revolution. And he writes, it has hitherto been assumed that our cognition must conform to the objects, but all the attempts to ascertain anything about these objects a priori, by means of conceptions and thus to extend the range of our knowledge, have been rendered abortive by this assumption. Let us then make the experiment whether we may not be more successful in metaphysics if we assume that the object must conform to our cognition. This appears, at all events, to accord better with the possibility of our gaining the end we have in view, that is to say, of arriving at the cognition of objects a priori, of determining something with respect to these objects before they are given to us. Just like Copernicus before, in his attempt to explain the movement of certain celestial bodies, was forced to change perspective in order to justify certain mathematical calculations, Kant understood that the only way we could possibly achieve a universal and necessary cognition of things is by changing completely our perspective, not by adapting our cognition to the things, but instead conforming these things to our cognitive structure. Throughout the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant will attempt to disclose our cognitive structure. In this sense, one could read this work from an epistemological perspective, namely as a theory of knowledge, and this is exactly the direction of interpretation taken by the Neo-Kantian school, and today by the analytic philosophy. But we have to remember that this cognitive structure, or our a priority, is deeply related to the possibility of reality as such. Therefore, the question of what is a priority is directly connected, as Kant self claims, to the possibility of metaphysics. Thank you for watching this video. I'm Ivan, and this is Empyreon, the Academy of Philosophy and Fine Arts.